would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. Welcome to the beginning of a whole new week, folks. I hope you had a fantastic weekend. Today we're going to spend a little quality time looking into the rent versus buy numbers. Kind of an interesting shift. And these rent versus buy numbers aren't just for those of you who are out there trying to decide if you should rent or buy. No. It's also for your folks out there trying to decide how you're going to invest in real estate. As that calculation shifts, your emphasis should shift with it in terms of the strategies that you use to change how buyers and renters are looking at their situation. So we'll talk about that. Before we do, I want to let everyone know that I did draw a name in the $50 Amazon gift card drawing on Friday. Email is out to that person. As always, if I don't get a response within 24 hours, I go ahead and I draw another name. I have yet to have to do that yet, so that's all good news, I think, for the folks who are involved in the drawing. So just a reminder that when you do sign up, when you do click that red button at the top of the page at therebelbroker.com in hopes of winning the $50 Amazon gift card, remember, the only way you can get it is if I actually have an address that I can find you at. So make sure that, if you've already done it and you used an email address that it was a throwaway email address, maybe you did it before we started having the $50 gift card thing happening, please do go in and do it again with an email address that you will notice an incoming email coming to let you know that you won. Now, the website is a great place to get in touch. Feel free to head on over. Therebelbroker.com is the website. You can click the contact link in the menu, and from there you can send along any of your ideas, suggestions, observations, or questions that you might have for the show. Happy to reply and try to give you whatever feedback I can. And of course, as I just mentioned, if you would like to get your name in the running for the next $50 Amazon gift card, and for those of you who are new to the show, we've been doing this every month now. This will be our 5th time that we've done it. And we'll be doing it again at the beginning of next month. So if you'd like to be considered in the drawing for that $50 Amazon gift card, head on over to therebelbroker.com. At the very tippy top of the page, you will see a red button titled Take the Survey to Support the Show. Use the same email address both times you're asked once you click that button, and answer the short list of demographic questions. And you're not only helping the show out, but you're giving yourself a shot at $50. So good luck to you, and congratulations to the folks who've already won that $50 Amazon gift card. All right, so I think today we're going to talk a little bit about rents in general, the trends that are going on with rents. We're seeing some very interesting stuff coming out of New York, but not just about what's happening and where it's happening, but also how you as an investor need to be able to adapt to this type of information in your marketplace. And as always, forewarned is forearmed, right? So if we figure these things out ahead of time, if we can see these things coming, there are a variety of ways that we can use this information to make better decisions today so that we profit more tomorrow. But let's go ahead and just take an overall look at things first. We'll start with what's happening in New York. Now, as we discussed previously, now if you're new to the show, we've been talking about the steady decline in New York in terms of rents. They built tons and tons of new apartments in New York, which has had a very dramatic effect on their rental marketplace. We have also seen in some other areas, like mine, for instance, a large growth, a large emphasis on building apartment-style housing, but no single-family residential style housing. That has yet to really put a dent in what we're seeing here in the Silicon Valley area, for instance, where I am based. But New York is absolutely hitting it. Now, this comes to us from Zero Hedge, but they're also reporting on news that comes from Bloomberg. So it's really more about the stats. But I think one interesting thing to note about this is that volatility or changeability, either up or down, exists in all markets. If you talk to someone 2 years ago, and I know because we had conversations about rental markets 2 years ago, and if you brought up New York specifically, nobody was saying that anything was going to happen with the rental market in New York, particularly on Manhattan Island, in terms of rents going down. And it amazes me how folks just don't grok that stuff happens. The latest February 2017 rental report from Douglas Elliman, the number of new leases signed on Manhattan apartments crashed 27.9% year over year. And that's on par with the downturn that we saw last month. Listing inventory surged, so the number of apartments available was up 11.7%, and the median rental price dropped 1.7%. Now, given this continuing increase in inventory, that price is going to have nowhere to go but down. Now, granted, a 1.7% drop is not ridiculous. It's not huge, but it's a trend, right? It's the direction that things are tending to go right now. The Manhattan real estate market, let's see, what else? Median rental price was down 1.7%, listing inventory up 11.7%. The number of new leases down 27.9%, as we mentioned. What was the other one? There was one other interesting number I saw here. So they don't have the vacancy rate listed here, but the vacancy rate in January was 2.35. And then in February, which is actually here it is. So they give you what the vacancy rate is, but not what the change is from last year, is at 2.31. So the vacancy rate's actually hovering right around the same. But we are continuing to see an inventory number that should worry folks. Will this jump into a much bigger problem? Well, it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But it has absolutely, at least, even if you're an optimist, all you can say is that it has flattened what has been referred to in the past as a market that really was just going to continue to grow as the economy grew. Now, Bloomberg was saying, quote, "There's so much inventory, and that influx is hitting across all price points, even the studios." There were a lot of studios that hit the market and have been sitting there. They had to reduce prices. Until now, studios, smaller, cheaper, and in demand among young job seekers in Manhattan, had better withstood the pressures from the wave of apartment construction that kept a lid on prices across the market. Now, even those units are getting reductions as landlords fret about rising vacancies, and renters at all price levels sense they have the leverage to demand a better deal. In the months of January and February, we had customers requesting 3 to 4 months free, which is pretty unheard of, according to Melinda Sakari, a broker with Douglas Elliman. Let's see, is there anything else here that was particularly interesting? So one other little tidbit that I think is interesting on this one is to look at it in terms of the submarkets, whether it's East Side, West Side, or Uptown. The number of new leases in the Uptown market was down 21.5, but the median rental price was actually up 6.7. The West Side market was down in rental price by 3.2%, with the number of new leases down 28.8. And the East Side market saw the median rental price down 2.2%, with the number of new leases at down 28.3%. Downtown median rental price up 0.8%. A number of new leases down 28.5. Now, what's interesting is the number of new leases in general across the board is down by nearly 30%, only 21.5% in Uptown. But that's an interesting trend. The fact that we're seeing a general downturn year over year in terms, and because remember, when you're comparing month to month, you need to take into account seasonal things. Looking at this and seeing that the same time last year, we're seeing fewer people coming out to lease. That's kind of interesting. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think it's just an interesting thing to note in a marketplace that for a long time was thought to be pretty bulletproof. Now, once we look at that as a reality, let's go ahead and take a look at what Risk Media's House Call site is saying about this subject. The title of their article is "Rising Rents Offer More Home Buying Opportunities." So they're absolutely coming at this from the standpoint of this rise in rents has reached a point where it's going to push home buying. So let's go ahead and hear what they had to say about it. sort of coming down on this rent situation as the rising rents are sort of sweeping the country. What we've heard from New York, though, is obviously a slowdown in that. There are, as I mentioned in my local area, that's not hitting here quite so much. We're definitely still seeing a very robust rental market, continuing increases, continuing in everything, right? It continues to be a seller market and it continues to be a landlord's market. So I'm not sure when that might make a change, but we have seen more construction happen here relating to creating apartments. And when those come online, it'll be interesting to see what that does to the marketplace. This is a quote from Kenneth Johnson, PhD, real estate economist for something. Quote, "We are not where we were in 2012 when nearly any purchase was a sound financial decision. However, overall, we are now in a situation where aggressive marketing from sellers combined with due diligence and sound negotiation from buyers is creating a housing market that's more in line with what we've seen historically." Now, I actually think that's kind of an odd thing to say. I would not describe our market in terms of historically being normal. I suppose it is if you only look back to, say, 2000. But if you look back over the last 20, 30 years, I would call that period of time from, say, about 1998 all the way up to the downturn as the history we never want to repeat. Now, we've covered this topic a lot of times on this show over the years, and I get we have some newer folks, so that maybe I'll devote a show to sort of recapping that. But the insanity that got us where we were in 2007 and 2008 was not this weird little blip in the market. It was something where the seeds were sown for that, going all the way back to, if you want to really go back, all the way back to the early 70s with the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act, which in 1994 finally got teeth. Before it was sort of just the government saying, you know, you really need to do this relating to subprime lending and having the authority to do something to banks, but not really exercising it till 1994, when a bank in Boston, I believe, wanted to acquire another bank and open it under their own name. And the government said, no, you know what? We don't think you're doing enough lending to underrepresented folks. You're not doing enough subprime lending. So you need to do that. And all the banks suddenly looked at each other and went, oh man, look where we are now. We are going to have to do this. And they started doing it. So in 1995, you started to see it ramp up. It really kind of hit its stride in 1999, 2000. And from there on out, you were getting stated income loans. You were getting 110% loans. All the subprime stuff started right then. So whenever some of these folks say something is historically normal, well, you don't want that history. That isn't the history of real estate lending or real estate business that you want to emulate. There was nothing normal about that period of time from about 1999 on. I can remember in 2000 and 2001 being stunned at the kinds of loans that my clients were starting to get. And that level of being stunned only got worse as we got closer to 2007 and 2008 because it was just ridiculous. There were folks able to get money so easily, it was nuts. Now, recently, we've sort of talked about different topics where the same sorts of policies are being put into effect, or at least the result is the same, but being nudged in certain different ways. For a good example of that would be, we were simply okay with a lower credit score, for instance, for some folks to get loans. We just sort of looked at it, well, okay, well, you know, real estate prices will always go up, so our investment will always be secure, so we won't worry quite so much about that credit rating. Now we're talking about being tougher on the credit rating in terms of requiring a higher number, but we've screwed with the number. We've screwed with how credit scores are calculated so that folks get an artificially high number. So we're achieving the same thing. We're reaching down into the folks who have a challenged credit history. And I still occasionally get people pushing back on me now about this. But if you just go and read why the FHA does X, Y, and Z, or why certain lending policies are in place, in any paragraph that they use to describe that, they state it. They simply say to reach out to less able borrowers. And that's, if you were to define the word a subprime loan, the same wording would be used. So I don't understand how there's any confusion. It's not even really a question of extrapolating, since they specifically say it's to enable more buyers. Well, which buyers need enabling? Is it the person with the 800 credit score and the $100,000 cash to put down on a home? No, of course it's not. So when they're talking about enabling more buyers, they're not talking about reaching to the upper borrower. They're talking about reaching down to the subprime borrower. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and push through this and talk a little bit more about this and also try to include some strategies on how everyone should be handling this news right after this, so don't go away.
Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right, aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner, broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909.
Welcome back, everyone. We're talking about the rent versus buy calculations and news items that are floating around right now. More and more, we're seeing the headlines and the pundits pointing towards a scenario where it makes more sense to buy in different marketplaces than it does to rent. And of course, this has broader implications than just what a buyer or seller is being told to do. It also has implications on what landlords and investors might want to do based on an increased probability of folks looking to buy rather than rent, or seeing renting as not a good way to spend their money. If you're a landlord, that's the last thing you want to hear. So your strategy should adapt to those kinds of things depending on how much this trend is impacting your local community. So we already talked a little bit about some of the stuff going on with New York, and also sort of reviewed the information relating to what's going on with subprime lending and other types of things, and how the historical reference to real estate is always one I watch for. We went over that a little bit before the break, but whenever a real estate professional or a PhD or an academic is talking about historically relating to real estate, I always love to get more details, because they're almost always talking about the time period from 2000 up to 2008. And you never want to be in that real estate market again. It was not a good thing. All the things that were going on during that time period is what got us in trouble. So if you're talking about historical marketplaces, don't suggest that's where we want to be to me, because you're not going to convince me that that's a good idea. Okay, now they have an index here called the Baracha, Hardin, and Johnson Buy versus Rent Index. Now, I will have a link up to this story that's referring to that research, but I'll also have a link to the research itself if it's something you want to check out and just see what the numbers might tell you. You might be able to pull more specific information out relating to your local area. We're going to cover a little bit of that here in larger terms or more macro terms, but obviously it's impossible for me to cover the micro terms of everywhere in the country. I'm going to have to leave that one to you, but hopefully you'll see the tools needed to do that. And to find those, just head on over to the website, therebelbroker.com, and check out the show notes for today's show to get access to that information. All right. It shows that 15 of the 23 cities that were studied are set in buy territory, meaning you would be better off buying than renting in those marketplaces. Now, another 5 are only marginally in the rent category, leaving only about 3 of these cities solidly in the rent category. Let's see here. Home prices. Let's see. The news only further fortifies the positive outcome of the latest S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index, which showed home prices rising at the highest annual increase since June of 2014, roughly 5.8% year over year. That's news we covered last week. And only urban places to show a discouraging market condition, and this one's going to blow you away: Dallas, Denver, and Houston. So 2 Texas cities are now showing that that those marketplaces, the rents there are still in a position where it makes more sense to rent. And the news from Denver is maybe not so surprising because that's what we've heard, right? From folks who I don't know why I get in terms of percentage of folks who reach out to me, I get more folks from Denver maybe than anywhere else. And the one consistent thing I've been hearing now for almost a year and a half is that renting an apartment, anyway, maybe not single family residentials, but renting an apartment has been ridiculously easy. Incentives, free months, get a toaster, that kind of stuff. Folks handing out incentives for rentals. Whereas buying a house has been nearly impossible. So it's kind of interesting that we haven't reached the point where it's not even on the borderline of whether or not you should decide whether you should rent or buy. They're just saying it's solidly in the rent category. The scores for Dallas, Denver, and Houston have had us worried for some time now, according to Eli Baracha, PhD and co-author of the index and assistant professor in the TNS Holo School of Real Estate at FIU. Quote, the last time we saw scores of this magnitude, housing market crashes soon followed. Now, that's another reason why I wanted to cover this topic today. For those of you who've been listening for a little while, even if you've only been listening for a couple of weeks, we've covered some amazing data and compared and contrasted that to past major downturns. The most recent downturn, if you wanted to go back, and I also even went so far as to start talking about the 1930s a couple of shows ago. Apologies. That was the history major in me coming out. Aside from being a student of the last few years of our real estate business, I've spent an awful lot of time reading about what went on in the Depression just because so many comparisons were really drawn to that period. But you don't even need to go back that far. You can go back to the tech bubble of 2000. You can go back to the savings and loan scandal of the 90. You can go back to another downturn we had in 95. All of those really sort of blips, maybe the tech bubble, one of the bigger blips. But it's interesting that they make this statement that when they see things like this going on, they tend to see a housing market crash not long after that. Given everything else we've talked about, coming up with your plan B if something goes wrong, I think is a wise thing. I'm not going to suggest that you sell everything you own and buy gold and build a bunker in your backyard and buy freeze-dried food. I'm going to suggest that you rationally look at what's going on in your local marketplace, taking this as another piece of data and deciding what makes sense to do with your property. We're gonna talk about what some rational things to do are with your property as soon as we've covered a little bit more of this. Now, the overall verdict, according to these folks, and remember, this is the common verdict we're hearing from a lot of folks, is if you can afford to buy, the time to do so is now. What I find interesting is that the sentence literally before this was, the last time we saw scores of this magnitude, housing market crashes soon followed. If the housing market crashes, do you want to be the person who bought it before the crash or after the crash? Those two things kind of contradict each other to me, right? If I'm about to tell you, hey, you know what? This market of stuff in widgets, man, it's about to go through the floor. You better buy now while the prices are still high. Doesn't make much sense, right? So I'm not sure that that's the rational advice, but it is the advice I would expect from someone or some organization that kind of has a vested interest in activity in the real estate market. So I'm not sure where these guys come in. As I mentioned, this is Risk Media, so I usually get stuff that feels pretty non-biased from these folks. So I'm not real sure why that kind of obvious contradiction is there, or maybe it's only obvious to me. Maybe I am misreading this entirely, but to have in one sentence a guy say the housing market will crash soon if things happen the way we've seen like this in the past, and then the very next sentence to be, if you can buy in, you should do it now. To reach their findings, the FAU Index incorporated property appreciation from housing markets around the country. The data is joined by rental, maintenance, and alternative investment data streams. Together, these factors can indicate when and why housing markets change. Now, as I said, you'll be able to get access to this data at the website that I'm going to have links to in the show notes. So make sure to check those out. And let me just read off the cities that are included here. There's the United States in general. And right now, the United States in general, on average, is in the buy zone. In other words, buy your home rather than rent it. But they've also got Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dallas, Denver, Colorado, Detroit, Michigan, Honolulu, Hawaii, Houston, Texas, Kansas City, Missouri, Los Angeles, California, Miami, Florida, Milwaukee, Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, New York City, New York, Philadelphia, PA, Pittsburgh, PA, Portland, Oregon, San Diego, San Francisco, Seattle, Washington, and St. Louis, Missouri. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run down all of those and tell you whether it was in the rent or buy side of the line. But I'm also going to suggest that you go to that website because you can actually download the raw data for every single one of these cities. And if you want to maybe get a better idea of what the scenario is in your city, I'm going to strongly suggest that you take a look at these. Now, it's also going to be important for you to take this as not a conclusion on what you should do. Remember, even city data may not be specific enough for your situation. I want you to go out there and get more data, figure out more specifically what's going on in your submarket to figure out what the smart move is. Now, in Atlanta, Georgia, the numbers are on the buy side. We actually already talked about all of these are on the buy side because I don't even think I need to go through these again, right? Because we already know that the three that weren't were Dallas, Denver, and Houston, I think, right? And Honolulu is right there. Let's find any ones that are just really close to the line. We already talked about the three that are definitely in rent territory. And boy, I tell you, Denver is way in rent territory, which kind of surprises me. So most of these ones I'm seeing that are in buy territory aren't way into buy territory. They're just a little bit over the line. There's a couple of exceptions here. Places like Cincinnati and Cleveland are pretty much over the line, but Dallas is way up there. Denver is way up there. Right on the line is Honolulu. That's a tough call. I'd say it's almost going to depend on your circumstances, right down to what neighborhood you're in or what kind of a deal you can negotiate. And Kansas City is right there on the line. It is actually coming out of a buy market and moving towards a rent market. That indicates a possibly interesting shift in what's happening with prices. Los Angeles is barely in buy territory. It's almost up into rent, but it's been in buy and it's slowly moving up to rent. That's an interesting trend. If you're in one of those situations where you're seeing an interesting change from being in a buy territory and going into rent territory, I think that's an interesting transition. There's other places that have been very flat, like Milwaukee, that's been relatively flat since 2011 and has been in buy territory. Let's see here. Where else is just kind of more sexy? Pittsburgh is interesting. Relatively flat, but still sort of a little bit into the rent zone. Portland in the rent zone, but not by a ton. San Diego, relatively flat. 2012, it was solidly in buy. It's still on buy, but very close to rent. Seattle is barely in rent after coming out of a pretty long period of time being in the buy zone. St. Louis, still pretty solidly in the buy area. It's been there for quite some time, since about 2011. So interesting things to note there. Now let's take a quick moment to talk a little bit about some strategies here. These are things you need to be aware of because, and specifically where your property is or what strategies you're contemplating using. If you're seeing things moving more and more into the rent category, well, that simply means that prices have gotten to the point where in terms of what is being charged for rent versus what's being charged for a mortgage are to the point where you end up spending less by buying. And your initial thought might be, well, then I don't want to rent, right? I might want to, in that case, flip. That just tells you that rents are high, but it also tells you that probably that in that scenario, rents have peaked. Once you start getting a larger number of buyers or folks who need a place to live, choosing the rent option more than the buy option, or the buy option in this case more than the rent option, well, that simply means that that whatever the inventory is now, the demand for that supply is going to go down. As this concept of buying instead of renting trickles down, or the math just makes more sense, you're going to see a flattening in your rent. Now, does that mean you shouldn't become a landlord? No, but in my case, it would absolutely mean that my math is going to assume that I'm not going to see appreciation in my rent for a while, or that I might actually want to be in a position where I can afford to take less in rent in a year or two than I'm currently taking. So this is a strategy that you need to have in mind. If you're already a landlord and you're seeing this scenario where homes are now to the point where they're much more desirable, where more buyers will come out and buy because this math is working, that's going to naturally increase the demand for your property. Now, remember, the decision that buyers are making based on this is this idea that they're saving more money by buying rather than renting. So you may want to look at what your scenario is in your neighborhood, but you may find that this is the time to liquidate your property and move on to something else. Maybe buy a property in a different area where it's more lucrative for the landlording situation, where you can pull the maximum amount of value out in the market now and then reinvest that somewhere else where you can get more for your money in the long term. Now, as a investor who might be thinking other things in terms of flipping, if you're going to see that increased demand from buyers making that decision to not rent, well, then you want to jump in there and take advantage of that increasing demand on the buyer side. So instead of doing that buy and rent, maybe that means once you've learned what the numbers are doing in your local community, you're going to want to go ahead and put that on the market. It could mean a greater level of attention, which could mean multiple offers, which typically is going to mean you're going to get more for your money than you otherwise thought you could. So always make sure that when these sorts of dynamic changes are happening in your marketplace, you're ready to react to them. Nothing is more depressing than suddenly realizing that the planned increase in rent, or even just the stability in rent that you've counted on for 3 or 4 years, suddenly goes away. And you discover that in order to be competitive and get the quality tenants that you need, you actually need to charge a little bit less because home folks who need a place to live are now looking to buy rather than to rent. Now, also fold into this other strategies we've talked about. If you're a landlord and you're currently finding yourself in this situation where maybe it makes sense for you to go, but you want to have a very easy sale of your property, you might consider doing a lease option with the current occupant of your home. If you are in a place where more and more renters are deciding to become buyers, you can bet that there's a pretty good chance that the folks currently in your rental have talked about buying. Odds are they've talked about it anyway. Now, before you simply have them come up and say, we're canceling our rental, we're going to leave in a month or 2 months or whatever it is, when you find yourself in a market like this and you're considering liquidating, there's nothing better than simply being able to say, I'll sell it to you. We'll create a lease. We'll either just do a sale. I mean, it could just turn into a normal sale with no fuss for you, or it becomes a lease option where maybe over the course of 6 months you have it be a lease option or whatever to fill in with their timeline. Now, why would you want to do this as a seller? Well, number one, it's going to take a lot of stress off of you. If you have these folks get out or move out and you need to sell it, you're probably going to have to do some things to the property to get it into resale quality. And if you're already in a situation where this is happening, the cost to do that may not make sense, or at least the headaches to you may not make sense. Now, it could still be a good time for you if we are seeing this trend happening a lot in the area where your property is located and there is low inventory. Adding you to the inventory could just simply be a way of you taking advantage of an awful lot of folks who want to try and buy in that area. But the idea of not having to do any painting, carpet replacement, anything like that, because you've got folks that are in there already, they know what they're getting, they've been living in there for several years, it really makes the process a whole lot easier and can often reduce at least some of the headaches, if not some of the expense that are normally associated with selling your property. All right, folks. As always, the goal is to give you way more in value in terms of what you get out of the show than the time it takes for you to listen. I hope that's been true today. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you all next time.